At the last minute, yeah. Deacon Chris. And Mary, are you going to join? Okay, no, nothing to do with him. Okay, good luck.
Thank you, Father. And I do want to give a shout out both to Lydia and from Lydia to all of you. She was sorry she couldn't be here. She so desperately wanted to tell her story. We'll hold her for another time. But she also wanted me to tell you how much this community means to her and how much she loves all of you and has experienced the love of all of you for her. So she was very appreciative. So we miss her this morning, for sure. I'm going to start this kind of a pivot for us as the retreat team. I'm going to start by taking you back just a little bit and setting a context, and then I'll get into the testimonial piece. So if you remember back late 50s, 1960-ish, first off, the world was in a lot of turmoil, right? So we'd gone through the 20th century, the World War I, World War II, and all the horrors of those wars, all the tragedies of those wars, the advancement of military might and the power of weaponry and just everything from trench warfare to the nuclear threat that then lingered over us after that. So all the horrors of that early 19th or 20th century into the latter 20th century. Part of that, a note that I made was that I think between 1945 and 2000, there were 90 new countries formed. 90 new countries. And that was because of the collapse of some of the colonial powers, and suddenly you had all these independent republics being stood up, and there was just all this chaos around then, how those countries would be led, how their economies, their politics, everything else would be managed. So you had a world that was in disarray and chaos. And then Pope John the 23rd comes into power He's elected to the papacy there in 1958. And of course, we know him broadly for Vatican II, for him looking at how to update or how to align the church more effectively with all this change in the world. Vatican II was a piece of that, but another piece of that was he put out a challenge. They called it the 10% challenge. Before Vatican II, actually, I think this was 1960-61, where he asked the religious communities to send 10% of their people to places that there was need, right? To marginalized communities around the world. So he asked for 10%. Religious communities, but then also the diocesan communities really stepped up in a big way. They accepted what I would say was the Pope's countercultural challenge, both for the church to change and adapt, to aggiornamento they called it, then also for those individuals to step out of their comfortable lives, their lives of stability, the known life of living in whatever communities they were from, and to throw themselves out into this chaos that was the world at the time. Father talked about Pinochet, who came into power in like 1973, I think, or somewhere in there. But there were a lot of Pinochets that were vying for power, fighting for power, around the world. So then those two streams kind of come together in that you had priests, religious, lay ministers, lay missioners going out and serving in these communities where there was such uncertainty. For me personally, so we have a Honduras mission, most of you know that, and so active in Central America, I had that curiosity about just the history of some of those countries, and I'd heard about the different martyrs, Archbishop Romero for sure, but others, and so I happened to trip across a Maryknoll pilgrimage that was offered to bishops, priests, deacons. I think they do some lay separate, but so to the clergy to Central America, specifically Salvador and Guatemala. So back in January 23, I went on that pilgrimage. And I was just going to read a few of the comments that I made in my journal along the way, so you can get a sense of, as I experienced the lives of many people living and dead who were active back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, as Catholics were living in these communities. And because they were fighting for the poor, the marginalized, fighting for the people in a sense, not fighting for them, but leading them, ministering to them in those communities, they ended up suffering many of the same fates as those community members. So just to wander through my journal a little bit, and then we'll kind of go from there. And actually, I'll cut short. The first stops we made were Oscar Romero, and there was a fellow named, a priest named Alfonso Navarro, where they were martyred. So to give you a flavor for the pilgrimage, so the person that was leading the pilgrimage in the Salvador piece, especially, was Father John Spain. Many photos of Father John carrying Oscar Romero's casket at funerals and things. So this was a man who lived through some of this violence in a very personal and intimate way. And then he takes us to these sites and introduces us. We went to 15 to 20 different martyr sites, in a sense, or where people were killed. And then probably 15 or 20 other living witnesses that experienced some of the turmoil there, that really lived prophetic lives. They didn't choose, they weren't into the politics of the situation. I don't even want to talk about the dynamics that were happening in any one of the countries. But the fact was they chose to live with these people and to sacrifice their lives, and many times alongside them. I stood with, again, to give you a flavor for the pilgrimage, I stood at the altar where Archbishop Romero was standing when he was shot, looking out the main passageway that goes out a set of doors where the car would have parked where he was shot, standing over this outline of his body where his body fell, and some of the nuns came to try and resuscitate him and all of that. So it was a very deeply personal and moving sort of pilgrimage. Again, this was a couple of years ago. I'm going to highlight a couple of the personalities, and just if you can just imagine the type of prophetic lives that I'm talking about when I talk about these folks. And the first one I'll mention is Cosime Spasotto. And Cosime was a young priest from Italy that chose to go to El Salvador. He took up residency in a parish there. Idalia gave us the tour, and she just talked about what a lovely, beautiful human being Cosime was. He told stories about how he imported grapes from Italy that nobody thought there was any way he was going to be able to grow these grapes. He grew these grapes. He made wine. He was a leader in vocation, so he had there were several pictures of him with classes of young men wanting to become priests, and so his leadership in the vocations piece was just extremely strong. And he ended up shot. Somebody came in with an automatic weapon and gunned him down. He suffered from several wounds. The two quotes I wanted to offer is to express the type of person this was that went and put his life at jeopardy. One was the fact there's a plaque on the wall, and I couldn't find my picture of it. I'd tell you what it read exactly. But he essentially, like Alfonso Navarro, who was killed in '77, and Archbishop Romero, Cosime, ahead of the event, went ahead and asked for forgiveness for his killers. He knew he would die. They all kind of knew. They were all on various lists. They were all constantly warned, these folks, what was coming. So in the case of Cosime, he took the time to write out forgiveness for his killers. I don't know what kind of spirituality that takes, or what kind of being a prophet that takes. The other element of this that comes up over and over, so that element comes up over and over, that forgiveness piece. But Cosime, his family, of course, in Italy wanted him to come home and asked him over and over. The church would often ask too, but his family wanted him to come home. His quote was, "My parish is my family." So he was choosing to stay there and ultimately to die because his church, his parish, was his family. Kind of man he was. I'll flip over to an American. So Paul Schindler is an American. He is alive to this day, I believe. So he gave us a tour. He gave us a mass. He presided over a mass at a chapel that was at a shrine where the 4 Salvadoran women, so I don't know if you remember, but Ida Ford, Jean Donovan, Dorothy Cazell, and Maura Clark, the 4 women that were 3 nuns and a layperson. Jean was just a lay minister, a lay missioner. They were killed, and their bodies were dumped. There's a shrine there now, and then there's a church where Father Schindler gave us a mass and talked to us. He was he was back in the day, he was in Guatemala. This is in Guatemala. Back then, I think for about 20 years, mid-60s, or early 60s to early 80s. So he took that challenge directly from the Pope at the time and from the Diocese of Cleveland, went to Guatemala and served. He said his greatest fear, and this goes with with Cosme a little bit. He said his greatest fear, or their greatest fear, he talked a lot about Jean Donovan. He knew her well, and some others, he said, was that they will make us leave. Their biggest fear was that the church would make them leave, and eventually they did in his case. But if you think about it, that was his greatest fear. At the same time he was telling us that, he was telling us stories about, look, as he drove around, any corner you went around, you didn't know if that would be the last corner you'd drive around, because there'd constantly be these roadblocks. They'd be pulled over and potentially killed. As I said, Jean and the other women were eventually in December of 1980. So Paul talked about just all the stories that went with life in that setting. Anytime somebody was disappeared in the community or whatever, Father Schindler and also Cosme, they told stories about Cosme. They would go and they would confront the jailers. They'd go knock on the doors so that this person wasn't an unknown person, right? They'd put a name to him. They'd let him know that somebody was interested and loved and cared for him. They'd go on behalf of the family. So they would confront the people in charge, the government in charge, to make sure that they were fighting for these lost souls that were disappeared. And in that environment, he said they were warned constantly that they were on lists and kill lists and stuff, but they just kept after it. He told stories about there was a cliff, La Mirador, this cliff where as some of these folks that were disappeared were killed, they would burn the bodies and they would throw them over this cliff. It was at an ocean side. So he and Jean Donovan and others would rappel down, collect up the bones, collect up the remnants, and try and return them to the families if they known, or at least bury them somewhere to give families closure. So just these incredible stories of Father Schindler, Cosme Sposoto. I'm going to skip over a little bit. Father Greg Schaefer, he was there for 48 years in Guatemala. And he ended up, he lived through all of that, leading his people and being a parish priest, and did these wonderful things, incredible things. He has since passed of cancer. Chona was a woman that had walked alongside him, and Chona was just this woman of fascinating, strong character, and she told story after story of how they saved people by transporting them away from the military, saving children after they were orphaned with their parents, and kind of went on and on. But skipping through Chona and skipping through Father Schaefer, I'll go to Santiago Atitlan. So do folks know about Stanley Rother? We hear his name a lot, but he was a priest that was then killed in this town in Guatemala, Santiago Atitlan. They called him Father Aplas. I'll get back to that in a moment. But Father Rother was another one. He was put on lists. He was eventually made to leave. He ended up going home to Oklahoma. So Father Schaefer was from St. Paul, Minnesota. Father Rother was from Oklahoma. He eventually had to go back, but he kind of fought his way back to Guatemala, only to eventually fall victim to killers that shot him. So we were in his rectory. I sat for a long time, early morning hours in the darkness outside the room where he was shot, that now is kind of a little chapel area, just kind of pondering a little bit about what kind of a man Father Rother was. And there was story after story of how the people loved him and he loved the people, right? Just incredible choice and incredible character for all of them. So Cosme and Father Schaefer and Father Rother, a little bit about Chona, Alfonso Navarro, and Archbishop Romero. Just story after story of first forgiveness. So knowing that some of these folks that were doing the killing, right, were products of the world, as opposed to products maybe of of a prophetic life within our church, right, or of our faith, products of the world, they chose to forgive them, like Jesus himself would have, right? Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. The story and stories of these prophetic lives living forgiveness, story of staying in harm's way out of pure love of others. Jean Donovan, her quote was, I can't leave because of the children. Just love the children. And so her family, who was in the Northeast somewhere, wanted her to come home as well. She said, I can't leave. I have to stay for these children. So whether it's they thought of them as children or as family, Father Rother had, his nickname was the shepherd that wouldn't run, because he just stayed and fought. And he said he'd never been taken, and literally he fought these guys kind of to the death. A story of just staying in harm's way out of pure love of others, of accompaniment. And it's this mutuality and this solidarity. Once they went to these places and became part of that community, it's that one love that bonds them together with that community that was unbreakable, as Father often talks about. If the Holy Spirit runs for you and you and you, well, you could see in these lives as we went on this pilgrimage that literally they were bonded to the community in the supernatural, in this sense of love of each other. It was unmistakable and countercultural, to be sure. So these places became violent places, and all the oppression that went with it, fighting for power and wealth, as Father described Pinochet. It was the same in these cases. And yet these folks stayed there and in a countercultural way tried to lead their parishes. And although there was something like maybe 35, 36 priests, bishops, archbishops killed during all this time, so 36 or so, there were hundreds, if not thousands of others, of catechists, sacristans essentially, others that were in the church, because there was a church, the church was a place, the Catholic Church was a place especially that bonded people together in the Eucharist, as Father said, and that was seen as a threat, right? So many times the church communities themselves really suffered from the violence, yet they stayed together, they stayed active, they stayed committed to each other out of their sense of that. I made a note of disinterested love. It's a term that came to me, I'll tell you where in a second, but disinterested love meaning I don't count the cost and I don't look for a reward. It's disinterested. It is just love, pure and simple, for each other. And there's a complete mutuality to it. Where I came into that term actually was Dr. Rene Fialos, who started this mission that we're a part of in Honduras. And he at one point texted all of us and said how much he appreciated this unión de amor desinteresado or whatever, but this union of disinterested love. And that's what I saw in these people, just this complete sense of commitment to each other, love for each other in very practical ways. And in very fruitful ways. So a couple of reflections just from the priests that went along. I'm going to offer two of them that we all reflected at the end of each day. And as I said, this pilgrimage couldn't help but leave a mark. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I'm just chatting away. All right. So one was from this Father Mike. And he said, living at the rectory in Santiago Atitlan, this is where Father Rother was, all this going around, he expected it to be a place of martyrdom. That's why we were there, to look at this man who was a martyr. And he said, yet what he found was a living faith and a place of resurrection. And this idea that a place of martyrdom, as we live these prophetic lives for and on behalf of each other, it's a place that we are dying to ourselves, but out of that comes great life, the fruitfulness of that. And it was really evident in Santiago Atitlan. We went out they had 60 couples that went out after Sunday Masses delivering the Eucharist to homebound people. And we went alongside some of them and did that. So just incredible fruitfulness. The other was one of the priests scooped up a young man as we were standing after Mass and held him in his arms, and he said, hey, what's your name? And the little boy, so this is 40 some odd years after Stanley Rother, after Father Aplas, so 40, 45 years later, and the young boy says, Aplas. That was his name. So here is this just legacy from the love, great love that was lived in small ways up until his death. It's really in small ways that love was lived. He taught them about farming. He translated into their Mayan language the Bible, etc. Anyway, so these places of resurrection. So as we live prophetic lives, that's what we create in and around us. The other one was Father Lance Nadeau. And Father Lance, he's the superior general of the Maryknolls now. But Father Lance had a very interesting take on it. He said, he quoted Jesus saying, "No one takes my life, but I lay it down." And the question that visiting all these sites placed on his heart, and it's the question that should be on all our hearts, he said, am I laying down my life or am I just dying? So laying down your life means living that prophetic life, right? It's meaning intentional, purposeful love in and for each other and the community around us and our families, in small ways, in large ways. That's laying down your life. Or are you just squandering it? Are you just surrendering it to the world and letting yourself be carried along by the tides of time? And I say that a little bit passionately because I've stayed reflecting on that pretty intentionally over the time since that pilgrimage. So yeah, this idea of my laying down my life. I do want to close with one other prophetic piece that I think is so important. The other place we visited, everybody's probably heard of the University of Central American Martyrs. There were 7 Jesuits and their housekeeper and her daughter killed in 1989. There was one person missing out of the community back then, a guy named John Sobrino, Father John Sobrino. He was away in Thailand. So all his community is killed violently. And he hears about it in Thailand. He's with some people. And he says, I have some really bad news. My entire community has been killed. But without missing a beat, and apparently immediately, he says, but there is good news. They lived as good people. They showed us how human beings could live in great love. So for me, it was this idea of, do I live that way? Do I just see the bad news? Do I just look for the negative, the martyrdom, if you will? Or do I immediately pivot in faith, hope, and love to the fact that, oh my gosh, there is so much goodness that surrounds us? He sees in those people that died young ages, right, early in their lives and living full lives as professors and university instructors and stuff in the university there, and he sees them cut short, but he doesn't see just the bad of that. He sees the good that they lived all those years before. So do I live in faith, hope, and love, or do I witness to the world around me just from the bad, just from the negative? I think as people called to live prophetic lives, we're called to live really in that faith, hope, and love, and not just dwell on the other. I could go on and on about this, but I'm gonna end there. So thank you so much. Oh, that's right, I'm on duty.
Thank you, dear. So now we invite you to open to page 10 in your reflection books. And we're going to just quickly go through the questions that you'll be reflecting on. If a major theme of being a prophetic community is to be countercultural to our culture, where do you see that at St. Pius? After hearing Father Len's reflection and Deacon Chris's testimonial, did one of the stories mentioned by either particularly speak to your heart, and why?
Father Len's reflection spoke of living within the prophetic imagination of Christ instead of the imagination of fear or power. Where do you see signs of hope and spirit-led unity at St. Pius? Where might we be tempted to settle for comfort instead of courage? True prophets can hope and suffer at the same time. When you experience disappointment in the church or the world, what helps you stay rooted in hope rather than bitterness?
And Father Len's reflection named the false prophet's message as, you have to fit in. Where in your life do you feel pressure to fit in, culturally or religiously? What might it mean for you to stand out by conforming more fully to Christ? So once again, you'll focus on 1 or 2 questions in your groups. We'll have about 5 to 10 minutes reflection time. Go ahead and head back to your tables for reflection until about 12:40, and that's when we're going to have lunch. So I think we don't have any snacks right now because we're going to hold our appetites. And then we will start calling tables out at 12:40 for lunch, okay?
So just to comment, it is noisy in there, and so if you're especially hard of hearing or your small group's having a tough time, you can feel free to spread out where you can. So there's a couple of classrooms in the very back that still have chairs and tables set up. The library off on the side is available. Or to spread out even in the church a little bit and come back in here would be okay. We're just limited on space. And actually, most of the classrooms on this side are really cold, so I didn't open any of them up. So anyway, so make yourselves at home that way.
But either way, around 12:40 is when we'll start dismissing tables for lunch back there. Okay.
Thank you.